her out as a servant to the Jeremiah Thompson household in Middleborough, Massachusetts. She learned how to read and write from the Thomas children, and when her service was ended, she taught school for 6 months. Then she decided to join the Army in 1778. She dressed in men's clothing and walked 30 miles to the Boston area, and she used the name Robert Shirtliff, and there are several variations of spelling. She volunteered on several hazardous ventures. She fought in several battles before she was wounded, hospitalized, and found out. She was discharged on October 23rd, 1783. She was also excommunicated from the church for her actions. She returned to Massachusetts and fell in love with a farmer, Benjamin Gannett, and married him and had 3 children. In 1792, she petitioned the Massachusetts State Legislature for back pay and was awarded 34 pounds. She wrote about her escapades in the Female Review, which was published in 1797. 5 years later, she toured New England, expounding her adventures. She is the first woman to earn money as a lecturer. In 1805, Paul Revere wrote Representative William Eustis on her behalf. She received a small monthly invalid pension of $4 from the U.S. government, which was doubled in 1818. Women who did not follow the norm were not always lovable and attractive. Some were downright irritable and obnoxious. However, they were dedicated to their set goal. Most of them did not have the time or the temperament to play the damsel in distress. Remember, ladies, those who behave.
Women aren't usually the first gender you think of when you think of the Revolutionary War, but as we pointed out, women are highly capable in just about any situation. I'm sure you'll agree. And we want to thank you again for that eye-catching performance.
You left out one lady. There's a lady in the shopping section of Mecklenburg County who actually did more than Paul Revere. She saw the British coming at night. She knew they were marching someplace. She jumped on a horse. She rode completely across what modern-day Charlotte over to Sugar Creek and warned her husband that the British were coming to attack them. And she saved a whole bunch of people. And her name is Jane somebody, but it's easy to find. I can find her name. But,
That's not to say that I don't have her already in my book.
Speaker is a practicing attorney in Boston. She's also a lieutenant colonel in the Army National Guard, as well as the legal editor for Women and Guns magazine. It's a very impressive combination. You don't find all 3 of those very often. She is a trained historian. She's lectured extensively at MIT, Boston Public University, and many other places. And to show her dedication, she has driven down here today all the way from Maine. Driven, I said, not flew, to be able to give this presentation to us to talk about Marion the Man. I present Ms. Karen MacNutt.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for having me here. I'm a little bit intimidated because there's been so many very fine speakers here today. And I'm more of a hobbyist of Princess Marion than I am a historian. I haven't really worked much in the serious history field for quite some time. But when I was going to college and enjoying myself there, and after there, I would go to a public library or college library and simply run the indexes for Frances Marion. And it came up with some very interesting little off-the-wall stuff. I'm going to share some of that with you tonight. But before we really get into that, I think there's some things that we really have to kind of understand about history. And one thing is, words change. And words don't always have the meanings that we think they have. If you don't understand words, you can't understand what's going on. A very good example of that is Parson Weems in his biography of Marion said he was so small he could fit into a quart pot when he was first born. Well, a lot of people think that's a sauce pot, but it isn't, because Parson Weems was from New England, and in New England, everybody knows what a quart pot is. It's a lobster trap, and it's a fairly big item, and they call it a quart pot because it's divided into 4 quadrants, so you can catch 4 lobsters. Well, Weems also said Marion was the color of a lobster when he was born, and about the size of one. That's still pretty small, but not as small as would be in a quart saucepan. Chances are, because of that description, he was probably premature. And the very first thing I have to say about Francis Marion is, considering the age he was born in, considering the mortality rate of that age, he had wonderful parents that he was able to grow and survive to manhood. The other thing that people talk about Marion is they say he carried a small sword. And when they write that, clearly people are talking about tiny swords. That's a tiny sword. All right? That's not a small sword. A small sword is a technical term. This is a small sword. It's a gentleman's sword, as opposed to a horseman's saber, which is quite a bit larger. Horseman would carry this, gentleman would carry that. Francis Marion carried a gentleman's small sword, not a tiny sword. When we talk about history, I personally found the historical method when I was in college and learning it rather limited. Part of that is because it depended so heavily on eyewitness testimony. Testimony, see, I'm a lawyer, that's not creep in here. Lawyers know that the most unreliable source of testimony, most unreliable source of evidence is eyewitness testimony. And the reason is that when an eyewitness sees something, they interject themselves into it. They interject all their prejudices into it. And they have a whole bunch of preconceived ideas of what things should be. So therefore, that witness is really not terribly reliable. Not that they lie, but they just don't necessarily see things truthfully. Or they come to something with a bias. For example, if I took the youngest person in this room and I asked them, is this gentleman a young guy or an older guy? Stand up for a second. I am sure he would say, this guy is an old guy. If I asked Mr. Stooks the same question, he'd say he's a young guy. And the point is, thank you, Stan. The point is that we all come with different viewpoints. The other thing we have a problem with Marion is we don't have any good witnesses. Our authors that we rely on are Horry, but Horry didn't really write the biography of Marion. It was really written by Weems, and a previous speaker has spoken about how unreliable Horry's biography was. James wrote a biography. He wrote it long after the event. And he was looking at Marion through the eyes of a very young man who was clearly hero worshiping. So he didn't see any faults in Marion. And one interesting thing about James, that kind of sets the stage for Marion, is he said that Marion was always the general. And that although he was kind, he had his friends, and he was kind to subordinates, he was always the general. And from this we know that Marion kept proper social boundaries. And how many of you have been in the military? All right, a few of you guys. Any of you buddies with the general? No. Generals walk on water, and they're not buddy-buddy with anybody. And they're aloof, because that's what generals are. So some of the things we think we know about Marion come from James. James was a very young man, he was a very junior man, and he was looking up at the general, and of course the general, being the general, was very aloof. This is not necessarily who Marion was as a human being. This was Marion, the general. Lee is a better observer of Marion. Lee's kind of interesting because he starts off, he comes down to the south, he has probably some preconceived ideas. He doesn't want to go off in the swamps with some militia guy. And by the end of his working with Marion, he writes to, he becomes one of Marion's biggest supporters. And he writes to Greene and he says, I'd like you to actually place me under Marion's command because it would please Marion, and I admired him. So here we have this very independent guy, Lee, comes down from the north. He's well known for wanting to go off on his own and not being under anybody. And he is so enamored with Marion by the time that they've been working together that he wants to be put under Marion. That is quite a testament to who Frances Marion was. Lee also writes he has memoirs of the campaigns in the South, and he does a little biography at the end of those campaign memoirs of all the different officers he's met during the war. And he's met just about everybody, from Washington all the way down. And I spent time reading all of those biographies, and I have to say, other than Washington's, Marion's was the most flattering, because Lee didn't hesitate to tell us all the faults of everybody else. And Lee, as he writes this little biography, and I've got a copy for you to take with you, because it's not often quoted for some reason, Lee is seeing Marion at a very stressful time in Marion's life. So again, he doesn't really see the whole person. He sees the stressed out partisan, and that's who he's writing about. But even seeing him in this condition, Lee's description of Marion is very flattering. Marion is also a difficult character to try to get a hold of because he straddles two worlds. He's a planter. He comes from the planter class. He comes from the low country planter class. These are people who are very wealthy. South Carolina was a very wealthy colony. Marion's kind of at the bottom of that. And Lee writes a little bit about that, and I just kind of like to quote it because it's probably kind of gives you a flavor of things here. He writes about Marion. Marion's father had 5 sons, of whom Frances was the youngest, who with his brothers received only a common country education. And that as the elder Marion's 3 sons arrived at the age of manhood, they successfully obtained a portion of their father's property, after which, as Lee says, the old gentleman became embarrassed in his affairs and was, in consequences, deprived of the means of extending similar aid to his 2 youngest sons. They had to depend upon their own exertion for support and comfort. So here we have Frances Marion. He's got 5 brothers. He has a sister, as we're going to talk about a little bit. And his brothers are established, but when it comes his time, Dad's blown the family fortune, and he's kind of on his own. So he's kind of at the bottom of the social class of planters because he doesn't have the money. On the other hand, to the backwoodsman that he will eventually work with, he seems like a wealthy man because he has all the trappings of the planter class. So when you read about Marion, you'll read in some accounts, oh, he was very wealthy, he was very important. And then in other accounts, it's sort of, well, yeah, there was this guy, Frances Marion, but he was, he was not that wealthy. And the reason you're getting this divergence is you're getting it from 2 different perspectives. Perspectives of people who were very wealthy, people who were very poor. He's standing in the middle. That actually puts him in a perfect position to ultimately command the troops he commanded because he could relate to both worlds, which was, for him, a good place to be in. The other thing we have to be careful as we go through thinking about Marion, we have to be very careful not to impose 21st century values on an 18th century world. In the 18th century world, this is before the age of Victoria, much of what we think of as being old-fashioned values come from the age of Victoria. Marion was before that. Men of power were expected to have wives and mistresses. Drinking to excess was common. Did Marion drink? Of course he drank. He did not drink to excess. People were polite to their equals, but they had no feeling of having to be polite to their inferiors. We had a speaker yesterday that talked about the Indians. The British didn't feel they had to give the Indians the courtesy of complying with their promises because the Indians were low. Well, people on the upper rung thought that about everybody. Divine right of kings and nobility was commonly believed. Punishments were harsh across the board. Slavery, both white and black, was common. Many Scots came to the New World as slaves. Georgia was a penal colony. Young men, if they did not have property, were apprenticed. And that was a little better than an economic slavery until they learned their trade. We've been told women couldn't have property. A well-read gentleman, an educated gentleman, learned Greek and Latin with Caesar and Dante and Machiavelli and those people. Other folks who were in business, they wouldn't bother with that. Because the reason you had a classical education was so you could be a good conversationalist at a party. So people in business didn't need that. And we see that in Marion's family. The brothers were all given common country educations sufficient to conduct business. They didn't need to be good people at parties. Very important was family. Family was everything. It was who you knew. And you see families joining, intermarrying. And it's not just one brother in family A marries the daughter in family B, but you see brother in family A, a sister in family A, second brother in family A, married to sister in family B, brother in family B. So this is truly joining of families. And it was done to form alliances for economic and political power. It's very common. Nepotism, giving favors to your friends, was the rule, it was not the exception. People have commented about Francis Marion, he was barely educated because he spelled poorly. Well, that's a 21st century value. There was no uniform method of spelling in the 18th century. Webster hadn't published his dictionary. People spelled phonetically for the most part. Now, if you went to William and Mary had what they considered to be the proper way of spelling everything. If you went to Harvard, Harvard had its proper way of spelling things. They weren't the same. If you went to the Inns of Court in Europe, they had a different spelling again. My father came from Canada, and we would spend summers up there. And unfortunately, I learned to spell using an English dictionary, and when I came back to Boston and had to write compositions, my teacher said, strange spelling. But it was the English form of spelling. So there was no uniformity. What's very interesting, if you read Tarleton's letters that haven't been edited, they appear to be all misspelled. But if you say the words phonetically, you suddenly hear a very strong Birmingham accent. He's writing as he was speaking. And to a certain extent, this is happening with Marion's letters also. So the fact they're misspelled is not a big deal. He's considered not well educated because he hasn't been trained in the classic languages, and he hasn't read the classic books that all gentlemen are supposed to read. Now he is related, because I've just said that family was so important. He is related by blood or marriage to some of the best families in the state. He's related to the Alstons with 2 L's, Alstons with 1 L, the Cords and Simmons, the Hugies, how do you say it? UG. The Elliots, the Mitchells, the Ravenels, the Motts, Isaac Haynes, and the Van der Horst families. Heavily intermarried with the Simmons family, and today when we went to his tomb, the tombstone for his wife was paid for by a Simmons, who was a cousin and who married after the general died, left the remaining wealth. So these family relationships were very important. If we look a little closer at his family, we see some very interesting things. Francis Marion, before the Revolution, and his brother Joe were both members of the legislature. He had 8 other first cousins who were members of the legislature. That is a political dynasty. How many, in Massachusetts it would be. How many people, tell me, are there many people in your legislature now that have 8 or actually 10 altogether, people so close by blood? No, that's a political dynasty. That means he was politically sophisticated. He was tied into a politically sophisticated network of people. They say he didn't say much in the legislature, but with that many of your relatives there, you don't have to say much. And if we have a legislator here, they will tell you all the business of legislation is done not on the floor, but in the back rooms. And this is what his family was doing. The generation before him, his parents' generation, were also in the legislature. I'm going to talk a little bit about his mother's family because that genealogy is better developed than the Marion genealogy. I have it outside spread out on the sheet. His mother was Esther Cords. She was the daughter of Dr. Anthony Cords, who was the first settler. If you look at the Cords family, a lot of these people have the word doctor or reverend in front of their names. This means they were educated people. Doctor does not necessarily mean medical doctor. It could be a doctor of divinity, or what we say today is a PhD. A fair number of these people, when they died, left estates in 5 figures. This would be over $1 million in today's money. So these were wealthy people. The Cords family were the vestryman of a bigger church, if I pronounced that correctly. And his grandfather and grandparents are buried here. So at the Battle of Quinby Bridge, when you start off with them fighting over that church, they're literally fighting over his grandparents' grave. And I don't know if he thought about that while they were shooting and the church was burning down and everything, but it must have crossed his mind that, gee, Grandpa's over there. So this is a very personal, it will eventually become a very personal war. 2 of his mother's brothers had military connections. His uncle James, who died when Francis was about 26, fought for the British as a professional military officer. His other uncle Thomas, who died when Francis was 17, was the colonel of the local militia. He was a justice of the peace, he was a trustee of the free school, and a member of the assembly. So again, important people. When Francis was born, we're not sure of his birth date, and those of you who do genealogy know the calendar changed in the early 1700s, going from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. He sometimes says born in 1832, and sometimes 1732, and sometimes in 1733. In 1732, that's when Georgetown was founded. So in reality, he grew up on the frontier. It was the coast, but it was still the frontier. It was recently settled. The golden age of piracy was coming to an end. There was still privateers raiding. There were people who were alive who remembered the exile from France. So all of this was part of his background, his tradition, his family, things he knew about. His parents were the first generation born in the Carolinas. He had, as brothers and sisters, he had a sister. And this is kind of, I think, important because we're all part of a larger family, and those family pressures interact and say who we're going to be. His sister married in Alston. She had 6 kids by that relationship, 5 girls and a boy. The boy died, excuse me, 1 boy and 1 girl died as infants, and 2 daughters married into the Simmons family, first cousins. She then marries Mitchell. She has 6 more kids, 2 boys, 4 girls, 2 die young. By 1775, she's a widow with small children. His brother Isaac marries Rebecca Alston. She actually lives to 1790, so she's probably one of the few people in that generation that lived to see her brother become a living legend. She lived in Georgetown. Isaac was a justice of the peace. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy dies young. He's interesting because Isaac dies in Georgetown on May 31st in 1781, 2 days after Georgetown is recaptured by Francis Marion. Kind of a bittersweet victory for Marion. But Isaac also is interesting because he is the only brother who is still alive during the partisan era of Marion's life. All other brothers have died. Isaac is the brother who is portrayed in some accounts as having been made to, quote, ride the horse by the British. The total story comes somewhat like this. When the British are coming back from chasing Marion, it's not really clear which the battle, so it's probably the Battle of the Bridges. They come back by Isaac's house, They break into the house, they trash the house. They take Isaac, they throw him on the horse. Now, if you go down to the Francis Marion Hotel down in Charleston, they have this picture of this guy riding a animal, a horse, backwards. That's not what the horse was. The horse was a form of corporal punishment used by the British Army for drunks, brawlers, and other disreputable people. And what it was a rail. The person was put on the rail, weight on each foot, and made to sit there for an extensive period of time, and you can understand it'd be fairly uncomfortable. Basically what the British did is they rode Marion's brother around the town on a rail. And this guy was a justice of the peace, which scandalized the town. Keeping that in mind, and keeping in mind that shortly after this, Isaac dies, is it any wonder why when Marion comes back before Georgetown the second time, British having abused his brother not being in good health, that they don't wait around for the town to be taken. They leave, and they leave rapidly, maybe with a little bit of a guilty conscience. His next brother, Gabriel, had 3 girls and 3 boys. 1 girl dies young. He's also a justice of the peace. He dies in 1777. The next brother, and by the way, this Gabriel is the one who owned Belle Isle, where we just went. His oldest son, Gabriel's oldest son, is also Gabriel. Gabriel is killed in the war. He's the kid who's beat up and murdered. Interestingly enough, when the younger Gabriel's will is probated, Francis Marion is the primary beneficiary of that will. He inherits a substantial portion of that land, basically a trust for Gabriel's younger brothers and sisters. The next brother is Benjamin. He's a justice of the peace. He also becomes a member of the assembly. He marries his first cousin, Esther Simmons. They have 5 girls, a set of twins. Wife dies in 1775. Benjamin dies in 1778. He also is a justice of the peace. The younger brother, the one that's closest to Francis in age, is Job. He marries twice. The first wife dies. He marries second, Elizabeth Gilliard, if that's the right way to say it. And he has 2 children. He dies in 1778. He's about 48. Interestingly enough, all of Marion's male relatives seem to die between about 50 and 60 years old. They're not long-lived people. By the time he's a partisan, with the exception of Isaac, all the male members of his family have passed on, most of them leaving small families, mostly leaving primarily girls. As a senior male member of that family, his family obligation should have been to look after his family, but he couldn't do that. Before he starts his partisan campaign, he goes and he speaks to Isaac, and one has to assume they're talking about taking care of the family. Interestingly, on that also, with Job, Francis and Job are very close, but Job's wife's family were Tories, and they tried to capture Francis and turn him over to the British. So we have the Civil War intruding itself into Francis Marion's family. We also see at the end of the partisan period, when there's this amnesty. If you come in and serve 6 months, you're going to be forgiven. In the letters of Green, there's a letter from one John Alston saying, I'm happy to come in and serve and become a good patriot now that I've been a Tory, and I'll serve under anybody but Francis Marion. So we have some bitter family intrusion coming in. Green being a nice guy says, hey, you got to take that up with Francis Marion. I'm not having anything to do with it. So Mr. Alston, in spite of the fact he disliked his in-law, had to go serve under him. So this is who his family is. They're important people in the community. They're people entitled to respect. They're people who are politically connected. So let me look a little bit more at Francis and what he was doing.